Hello and welcome to More Than Game. I'm Patrick and I'm delighted to be joined today by Paddy Boyland of The Athletic, and it's for a new series where we're going to dive into what it's like to be a sports journalist or a football journalist in particular in the changing landscape really of football media. Paddy, working for The Athletic, you're working for a publication that's kind of been at the forefront of that in the last 4 to 5 years, hasn't it, since it launched in the UK? And I thought it would be brilliant to get you on and talk about your experiences covering Everton, talk about your experiences covering sport and football in general, and yeah, where you see maybe the media moving forward, platforms like Substack, platforms like Patreon, the Athletic, this subscription model that we're kind of this subscription world that we're in now. So, first of all, yeah, thanks for coming on. And can you just tell me a bit about your career today and what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on, first and foremost. As probably most people know, I've been covering Everton for the Athletic since its UK inception in 2019. Before that, I worked for a number of different publications. I worked for ESPN, worked for the Mail online site for a little bit of time, and I was also working for a press agency where down in London, where I covered a wide variety of sports. And I guess the beauty with that role in particular was that was not just football. It was like one week you would be covering the Netball World Cup, next week it would be covering the Cricket World Cup. You'd have everything in there, a whole load of sports. And sometimes you get very little prep time before going to these big events. So you're kind of cramming in your research on the train up or down, depending on where you are in the country.
Yeah.
I
Doing a
just
bit
think
of research on fencing. There's yeah, fencing Rio 2016. I remember doing that. I was like, how the hell am I going to write about this?
Well, I got sent to the Netball World Cup, was in Liverpool a few years ago. In fact, not long before I joined the Athletic. So we're talking 2019. That was my last big assignment before I left to join the Athletic. And I remember on the train back to Liverpool, I was living in London at that time, and I think they put me on that because it's like, well, he can go back to Liverpool for a weekend. He'll be home, so he'll be happy, and he'll cover the games as well. Remember on the train back to Liverpool from London, just having up YouTube kind of like help guides, like effectively netball for dummies. And there I was the dummy. I was like, it's like, how many players are on the court? How does this work? How many halves or quarters are there? And all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's a very extreme example. Often you go into these things with what I'd describe as an intricate knowledge. I mentioned I covered the Cricket World Cup there. Cricket is what is one of my favorite sports and probably the sport I watch most when I'm not covering Everton for the Athletic. I've got this weird thing now where football in my head mechanically is work. So in my downtime, I watch less football than I ever have done. And that sounds really perverse when I say that to people, but I watch less football now than kind of I did 10 years ago. I watch less football now than I did 6 or 7 years ago. And that's not because I don't love football. I still have that enjoyment. It's just in my head, it's work. It just becomes work. So it's trying to create that separation between your work life and you kind of the rest of your life, your private life, and just trying to maintain that. It's increasingly difficult, particularly when you, as I did, grew up supporting the club.
Yeah, and I mean, exactly the same how I've described it to people as when I, kind of first got into about 10 years ago and then still absolutely loved and adored football. And the more you do it, the more you feel like it's work. I'm like you, I work across all sports. So, or like you did anyway. And it is nice to sometimes cover those different things. You just get out of that football mode. And I think this is what I'm going to touch on. And footballs, especially at this time of year with the transfer window, it feels like now the media and social media and media in general, it really is the 24/7 news cycle, isn't it? And like you guys, your colleague David Ornstein, he's obviously one of the go-to people for transfer news, for example, or breaking news anyway, or any exclusive. And it's like, I sometimes think with David, he must never sleep because it'll be like 1:30 and there's an exclusive gone out. But it is that 24/7 news cycle. Do you really feel the pressure? And have you noticed in the last few years that increasing? Or do you think it's always been there maybe and there's just more outlets now and more ways for people to get to stories that there's kind of that rush to be first as well?
Well, you're definitely right about David. I mean, I've woken up myself to messages and company platforms from him at all hours, and I'm talking early hours of the morning as well. So he doesn't stop, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's so well regarded and so respected within the industry and elsewhere. because he puts a shift in. As a general rule of thumb, I think you get out what you put in this industry. The more time you take to speak to people, to foster contacts, to further your own reputation, the more it kind of comes back to help you in the long run. Transfers are massive, and that's not going to surprise anybody, but it is now a truly 365-day-a-year industry. I still have people messaging me after the season's finished, and they don't have the same knowledge of what the job entails as others, and they'll say things like, "Oh, well, what are you going to do now for 2 or 3 months?" I say, I will not be short of content. Don't worry. Transfers in itself is absolutely huge, and I almost think it's become its own separate beast. You've got the football and the way that plays out, and tactics, and how the team is shaping up on the pitch in pre-season, all that kind of stuff. But then next to that, very, very closely linked, of course, is the business of transfers and how that all plays out. And there's more and more demand for that now, I feel. And as a result, you see media companies shifting focus more and more to that sphere. I mean, we joked before we started recording, didn't we, that there's probably never a good time to take a holiday when it comes to Everton, and that's one of my problems. And it's true. You look back to, let's use last summer as an example, and in June, most of the board left in acrimonious circumstances, and there was a huge fallout around that. You had an ongoing takeover situation with MSP that failed. 12 months on, we're back in a similar situation, not exactly the same, but a similar situation after the collapse of another takeover in the middle of that in 777 Partners. And then this summer, you've had 5 players through the door already. You've had 3 high-profile ones leave for around 70 million all told, a takeover collapse. And that's before you touch the sides of anything else. So there's always something, and particularly with Everton, we have this thing at the Athletic now where we probably regard Everton as one of the newsiest clubs. There's a few that we regularly keep an eye on, Chelsea, Newcastle. They've been basket cases over the last 5 or 6 years. Everton are in that category. They're right at the top of the agenda when it comes to news. So to answer your question, I think it is partly just Everton and the way they are, which makes it completely frantic. But as well, media companies go where the demand is. And at the moment, the demand is on the transfers. I do think transfers has become this kind of big, all-encompassing beast. And you have a lot of discussion, misguided discussion, I should say, of who wins the transfer window and stuff like that. It actually doesn't matter a whole heap. It's all well and good analysing a signing at the time and saying that looks like good business, but it's obviously, as we know, and not an exact science at all. And often the results play out over an extended period of time. So yeah, media goes where the eyes are, where the clicks are, and where the money is. And I don't see it changing anytime soon. If anything, I think summers will effectively just be, these are the transfers, and this is the most important thing now.
Yeah, there really is no, I mean, and I think obviously this year it was almost the respite of a major tournament in the fact that it wasn't just solely transfers or PSR issues, but within that, obviously this year we did have the PSR issues that Newcastle, Villa, Chelsea, they all joined the club. And it was a funny thing putting the Evertonian hat on as well as the journalist hat on, thinking, God, we're old hands in this now. Well, like, did you have colleagues from the Athletic of those clubs coming to you and being like, right, but what is this all about? Because we don't know what you in a 6 months experience now in this. And in general, you mentioned there with the Athletic and Everton in particular, and we'll touch on the job now. What has it been like to cover Everton in particular for the last 5 years? You obviously have done this day in, day out. You've covered some huge stories. You would have been there. Carlo Ancelotti would have been, what, 3 or 4 months into when you were covering Everton, and everything that's happened since then, COVID, going to games behind closed doors. What was like that? Just what's it been like this last, if you can sum it up in a few minutes, in the last 4 or 5 years covering this club in particular?
Truly remarkable for all the reasons you've outlined and more. I mean, I remember very early doors, as you say, going to Carlo Ancelotti, his first press conference, and that was at Goodison Park. And you couldn't quite believe he was there. And then after the press conference, he's invited into a room with different media organizations to do what we call breakouts in the industry, separate interviews with different media organizations. I still remember him walking into a room inside the main stand at Goodison. It was a corporate lounge actually, and he looks around the room and says to the Everton press officer, "Who here supports Everton and who here supports Liverpool?" And the press officer's just pointing out one by one. When he knows who each journalist supports, obviously sometimes it's hard to tell, but he kind of points at me, and he grew up supporting Everton, so Carlo kind of shakes my hand and gives me a kind of a knowing nod, and from that moment on, I suppose he kind of knows where the land lies a little bit with people around the club and people covering the club. We've had everything though, and what I always say about this job is it's not just about the football, and never really can be. Even in the last year, we've had stories about PSR breaches that involves delving into the minutiae of accounts and accounting, finances, all that kind of stuff, the intricacies of the Premier League's rule book and what is and isn't in there. We've had takeover situations, so almost overnight you have to become an expert on mergers and acquisitions, something that I never thought I'd really have to deal with. Likewise with the accounting and PSR. I mean, I've got friends who work in finance and who know about this stuff, and they laugh a little bit. Say, now you're 5 years in, you're a bit of a dab hand at this kind of stuff. And I say, we just never would have pegged you for that at the time, because why would you? Why would you? You go into the sports industry and you go into the football media industry, I suppose, to cover what plays out on the pitch, to do the big glossy interviews and to file reports from games and to cover the biggest clubs and the biggest competitions. I don't think you expect to to face all the issues, sometimes geopolitical issues Everton have had to face.
Yeah,
Over,
reading a 36-page report at 2 a.m, trying to get your head around some complicated interest rates or something like that, or interest payments. It's yeah.
that's it. And there are times we're lucky where we live in Liverpool. We're very, very close to one of the city's big parks. And sometimes I just have to take myself out of it and just go. And even if it's just a 15-20 minute breather just to clear my head, go, I've read, I think what was one of the reports, about 96 pages for Everton's PSR commission. I've read half of this, but no, I just can't see the wood from the trees. So I need to get out of it. Like I say, it's been a remarkable period. Um, there's always that joy and prestige attached to covering the club you grew up supporting. There's still that buzz occasionally when you go to a new ground or you interview a new player or you're working on a transfer story that nobody else has. Um, but I always say that in this job, your fortune is very much tied to the fate of the club. And if things are going well and swimmingly on the pitch with Everton and off the pitch with Everton, then my life is normally an awful lot easier. When things are bad and when the fans are disgruntled and when things are going wrong inside the club, very, very quickly that permeates through into your not only your working life, but I'd say the rest of your life as well. And I've woken up in a cold sweat on numerous occasions thinking through permutations for Everton relegation scenarios. Can Everton survive? I mean, particularly not last season so much, but particularly the season before and the one before that, where I'd just be looking at things and going, like, in my head, actually doing the maths at about 3 in the morning. I suppose it's a form of Everton-induced insomnia.
Yeah, I think we can all, or any Evertonian can emphasize with that. But I think that's the difference for you, isn't it? And other local reporters and other correspondents is, we cover Everton for my day job, and obviously I'm more than a game. And yeah, when Everton lose and you're still working on shift, that's the worst part. You Saturday 12:30 kickoff, let's say, and you're on a 2:11 or you're on till the middle of the night, and all it is you're thinking about that all day. But you have the extra pressure of, you mentioned the buzz that comes with it. It's the pressure of reporting on the club that you've supported all your life, isn't it, as well, and
Yeah.
knowing it inside out.
Yeah, and I live in Liverpool. Like I grew up in the city, got a lot of friends who support Everton, and a lot of family members, particularly on one side of the family, who supported. So I mean, I suppose if I get something wrong, I'm taken to task not only by subscribers of The Athletic and people on social media, but also my own dad and and people like that. I mean, there are times when I've gone back to see my parents, and my dad wanted to know kind of about the ins and outs of what's going. What are you hearing? Who are they going to be signing? What's going on with this situation? At times I just have to say, listen, I've just come home to try and escape this. Either I can't speak about it now, or I don't want to speak about it now, and I'm sure he gets a little bit disappointed at times when we end up in that situation. But sometimes you hear stuff from those inside and outside the industry where it's like, well, it must be great to cover a newsy club. And it's like, yes, to an extent it is. But actually, if I could ask for one thing this season, it would just be for Everton to calm down, even just for 5 minutes, just to give us all like the nice the panacea for me at the moment. As bad as it sounds, is just a comfortable mid-table season where you've got no off-field shenanigans and no points deductions and everything else. And then pushing on with a bit of promise for something more, because like I say, our fates are tied to those of the clubs that we're covering, and when things are going well, things tend to be easier for us. The access is better. We get to speak to more people. They're happier to talk. They tend to give you better lines for pieces that you write and interviews and everything else. When things are bad, it tends to be like a batten down the hatches, um, and people tend to clam up a little bit. So I just can imagine with all that in mind, it's probably not been the easiest few years covering Everton.
Yeah, absolutely. You've done a bang up job. But that's you mentioned something there that I wanted to speak about anyway, which was the access. And now I think what I've noticed in the last few years, and obviously like following the Athletic, but other publications as well, that I think the Athletic are probably at the forefront because they did go out and get such big name journalists as well, and they kind of, there's such an online presence, and I felt that the key to the Athletic from the outside in is the access. Like that has been a huge thing. And do you think in the last 5 years, because of publications like that and now media shifting to an online 24/7 social media kind of process, that clubs are starting to cotton on, that they can't maybe batten down the hatches as much as they may have done in the past? Like you mentioned there, when things are going badly, that, and it's a natural thing. It's a natural thing that a manager won't want to say as much, or they'll frustrate journalists by only giving one word answers to decent questions, or straight batting questions that are interesting, that people do want to hear, and they almost forget that they're speaking to the fans through through us,
Yeah.
through the journalists. That the point is to speak to the fans. Do you think that it almost, the annoying thing is that it needs to be the other way around, that when it is really going badly, whether it's at Everton or other clubs, that's when people need to speak. That's when people need to hear more, have more access, because it all feeds into the communication system anyway, doesn't it? That's what it is. It's PR at the end of the day. And when it is going well, as brilliant it is to have the access, it's almost like, well, I can write about it going well any day of the week. I'd love to write about that, but do you get do you get frustrated at times that it can be a bit like that? And do you think that's maybe the next step that clubs maybe can take down the future to be even more open?
Yeah, I think we all get a little bit frustrated that at various points in our kind of journalistic careers, you're right in saying that that is probably the time when things are going badly, that clubs need to be a bit more proactive and communicate to journalists, to fans, and everything else, almost in an attempt to reassure. I tend to see that there being a bit of a divide between American investors who come over to the UK and then invest in clubs and the way they approach their PR strategies, and everybody else. I think the British method is at this point quite conservative, small c, quite risk averse and quite cautious. Whereas some of if you come from an American sports background, a lot of their journalists over the pond are given much greater access, much better access. If they cover NBA or the baseball, often they go in the locker rooms after the games and speak to the players. And it's kind of unencumbered access. You don't necessarily have press officers all around you and everything else. That's not been the case here for a long, long time. And I think it's certainly frustrated journalists who are maybe a little bit older than I am, because they've seen over time their level of access reduce and reduce. It's interesting. I think with the Athletic, probably it took clubs and agents and players and other people in the game a little bit of time to work out what we were and where we kind of fit into the landscape, what we were doing, what type of content would work best. And some clubs obviously cottoned on faster than others. I think we've now got to a really good place where everyone recognizes the brand. They know we're attached to the New York Times, so we're not going anywhere anytime soon. But there's the potential for stuff to be carried on the New York Times feed, which obviously gives you access to a much, much bigger audience, particularly in the US. And press officers know who we are and what we write and the kind of pieces we write. And I always think there's such thing as kind of athletic-y detail and athletic-y pieces, the stuff that we write that others might not necessarily want to or need to or have the space for. And even down to word counts, like it was a bit of a parody at first, that these very, very lengthy pieces that probably should have been shorter in truth. Over time, I think we have rode back a little bit on the ridiculously long word counts, but we've still got the space. We don't have to cram things in to meet a print deadline. We've still got the space to tell a story over a decent amount of time. And I think what that means is that when clubs are granting specific access now, they will think of the Athletic. So, for example, I did a piece probably this time last year from Everton's training base in France and Switzerland, where I spoke to 3 or 4 figures at the training camp to get an insight into the preparations for the new season. It was Ian Wone, the assistant manager, Lloyd Parker, the then head of nutrition, a couple of players, and a couple of other support staff. And it was basically how are Everton getting ready. I think we were given that because people know that that's an Athletic piece. And sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes people will think to themselves, this is not an Athletic piece and I'll go elsewhere for this. But what I'm saying here, the very long-winded way of saying that, I think people now understand what the Athletic does, for better and for worse. And that means that they, when it comes to doling out access in this ever-changing landscape, they know where to place things. So I think we've got to a good point with that. I don't think there's much more work that needs to be done in that score. The interesting thing, I suppose, to see that how that develops over time, because we are continuously evolving, and so are the clubs.
Yeah, and then you've got platforms. So obviously, Athletic is that, I think, probably the spearhead of the subscription platform. But you've got Substack, which is obviously what More Than Game owns, which is starting to grow over in the UK now. Obviously, that again, you look at the American. I'm on the platform. You look at the American side of it. It is vastly different because it's an American platform, and they come through with that different access. And I can't remember if you remember a piece from a few years ago where an American journalist found out about embargoes. It's one of my favorite pieces, and there's like the absolute that he did it like a 1,000-word piece on just being absolutely stunned that embargoes were a thing. Whereas to UKJ, it's just a natural thing, and do not ever break an embargo, or you're going to be in hot water. So it is interesting things like that, and I think maybe as we're going forward, I don't know if you agree. Do you think maybe the British media will start to take, well, clubs as well and organisations maybe are going to start to take out that bit more access, and like you said, maybe go more specific with the access as well, as is always already starting to happen.
I think the big question for clubs in particular is how they handle what I would describe as the non-conventional or non-traditional media, new media. So prominent fan sites, for example, as well as outlets like Substack and everywhere else. I mean, again, we have a very traditional way of operating, particularly in the UK and in the Premier League, where you apply for your accreditation through a company, and that company grants priority to bigger outlets and bigger journalists with bigger followings. Access largely for non-rights holders is given to the bigger outlets. And we've not really had the conversation yet in public as to where those fan sites and writers for Substack fit in. Are they, as they continue to grow their followings and to become ever more prominent in this landscape, are they to be given more access? I mean, as it stands, they're not allowed in, for example, on the pre-match or post-match press conferences. Most of them, unless they've got a pre-existing media pass, aren't getting into games at the moment. Most of them aren't given invitations to attend the training ground or to go on these pre-season tours, post-season tours, mid-season tours, as they sometimes are. So I think that's one of the big questions for these clubs to answer now. It's how they adapt to that new landscape, because it is a fast-changing industry. I think we, as you rightly point out, we're at the forefront of the subscription model here after doing it in the US. But lots of others now, kind of the more established media outlets in the UK, they have some form of paywall and some form of subscription. I think because the way advertising revenues are dwindling, that is increasingly the way media companies are looking to go. But then you also have this new niche, which is very, very specific and often community-led media looking at niche issues. So it might be Everton Football Club by Everton fans and for Everton fans. It could be anything. It might just be a very specific style of cooking that's on a Substack app. I think that's the way we're going here, because often fans want such detailed coverage of their clubs that a traditional media outlet, a newspaper, for example, can't always provide it. You look at, in some cases, some of these newspapers have northern correspondents. If you're a northern football correspondent at, let's say, for argument's sake, the Telegraph, to pluck a name randomly out of my head, you've got a huge patch to cover. Newcastle, as we've already said, and newsy enough as it is, Everton and Liverpool are worthy of their own dedicated reporters. You've got Leeds United, this massive entity in the middle in West Yorkshire, and that's before we even get onto the Manchester clubs. Then you have to have a discussion around coverage of the bigger Championship clubs in Lancashire. So there's so much to get through, and I think what fans want is that really detailed, intricate insight into what their club is doing. They don't necessarily really care about what Crystal Palace are after, or what Fulham are doing in the market, or anything else, unless it relates directly to how their club is likely to perform over the course of the season. So we are entering new territory where it is predominantly subscription based. It is more focused. I think there are great opportunities with community, and that's certainly something that we were really keen to tackle when we first launched in the UK. It was the idea of the subscribers being closer to the writers, to be able to ask more questions, to be able to suggest piece ideas in some ways. I mean, I wrote a piece earlier this summer just detailing all the players below the Everton first team and the academy, and giving a bit of insight into them. And that came because subscribers repeatedly asked, who's the best player below the first team? Who can we look to see next year? Who's going to go out on loan? And giving supporters a bit more of an interface and making them feel as though they're part of the content, I think, is that next step for most organisations. Live blogs, live Q&As, mailbag features, things where subscribers suggest questions, feeling as though they're part of a community rather than they're just reading what's given to them. If you're paying for a service, you need to feel as though you're a part of it, that you're getting your value for money, and hopefully that's what we've done. Hopefully we've said, well, we'll do these pieces, and we think we have a good idea from our own metrics what works and what doesn't. We think we have an idea, because we've got a reporter on the ground in Liverpool, what Everton fans are talking about here and elsewhere. But we also want to hear from you. We want this to be yours as well. And when I talk about community, I don't just mean The Athletic. I mean Toffee TV, honing that community, and people get to know the figures there, the faces there, View from the Bullens. People get to know those guys as personalities and go to them for that reason. That's where this is all going. I think.
That's where I think the clubs as well. I mean, I know they are starting, but there's obviously pushback, and it's you're in that middle ground, right? Like you said, you're, for a very respected organisation that is online based, and it's class. What I've made with the Athletic is it's almost traditional journalism, but in a very new, modern format. And then you've got this new media completely, which is your podcast services, your fan channels, for lack of a better word, independent media. They're the ones that the clubs, I feel, that there can be that crossover between everybody in a way, and I feel like he's got to go that way, or people are going to get left behind, whether that's the clubs or whether that's the journalists in question or the media organisation. So finally, Paddy, just two things to wrap up with. One, I want a very quick, if you can, highlight from the last few years covering Everton. And then also just any very brief advice for people who are wanting to start out and get into sports journalism. You know, the temptation is probably to say don't bother and get a job that pays brilliantly, but you know. Yeah.
I'll try
Apart from
not
that one.
I'll try not and do that one then. Highlight would be meeting Carlo Ancelotti, being part of press conferences, speaking to him, asking questions, all that kind of stuff. A bit more nerve-wracking than it is for other managers for obvious reasons. And just that sense of, I grew up supporting Everton, and I saw kind of Walter Smith teams, and I saw David Moyes teams and everything else. We've seen Sam Allardyce teams, and yet I'm here covering Carlo Ancelotti's Everton. It just felt a bit mad at times, a bit like a fever dream with James Rodriguez there receiving Echo Falls on County Road and everything else. None of it really felt real, and that feeling was heightened by COVID, of course, and the fact that we saw less and less of those figures as the pandemic truly hit. That's an obvious highlight. I still think like going out on the tours, like being another one off the top of my head, being in Baltimore when Everton played Arsenal in pre-season a few years ago, and speaking to people who follow Everton and read our stuff, and I'd ask them where they were from and how they started to support Everton, and I'm from Texas and I started supporting Everton with Tim Howard, or I'm from North Dakota and I started supporting Everton before Preki arrived, and all this kind of stuff. Just being there, and genuinely thousands, the Toffee TV lads were there as well, thousands and thousands of Evertonians from all across the US and elsewhere, just with this kind of shared love of the club that obviously we follow and grew up supporting. So there's a couple of highlights. In terms of advice for people looking to get into the industry, a quick bullet point list: do your qualifications, get experience, write as much as possible, read as much as possible. Don't go big on social media early doors with posts that are going to come back to bite. Try and retain your professionalism and everything else, because you don't know who's watching, who's looking, and how far back those data mining processes go when it comes to due diligence for jobs. I also think that it is about speaking to people and forging relationships and having as big a network as possible. So put your best foot forward, have the conversation, ask the thing that you might not get a response to, but it's worth asking anyway. If you don't ask, you don't get. And that's the case for transfer stories, it's the same for club briefings, it's the same for even if you just want a couple of weeks at the local paper while you're doing your internship, all that kind of stuff. Attend matches, speak to people at games, make sure people know your face. And I think that's just about everything. I think you've got to have a can-do attitude, and you've got to be prepared to kind of roll your sleeves up and do loads of different things. At various points, I did never really feel as though I was going to be covering Carlo Ancelotti's Everton. I was doing vastly different things, and it's just about sticking at it and trying to make the most of it, I suppose. So yeah, it is tough though. It can be very, very tough. There have been experiences where I've been at my wit's end with Everton for various reasons, kind of watching their fortunes slump on the pitch, or I've been sat on a platform somewhere, the less glamorous side of it, sat on a platform scrambling to try and find Wi-Fi to write a piece and file a piece so I can meet this ridiculously short deadline after a game or match or whatever it is. So sometimes people focus on the glamorous stuff. It is certainly not all glamour, but I wouldn't change any of it really for the world.
Yeah, it's worth the effort when you get those highs. It's a bit like supporting Everton in general, isn't it? You get a lot of ups and downs, but the ups are definitely worth it.
The comfort are worth it.
Yeah, when they come along. Brilliant, Paddy. Thanks so much for joining me
Nice
today. It's fantastic, brilliant to have you as the first guest. Hope to get this series out as coming over the coming months and weeks. We'll have this semi-regularly and lining up some more great guests as well. So please do tune in for that. And you can follow Paddy on social media at Patric at Paddy Boyland, I believe, is it? Yeah. And obviously subscribe to The Athletic, and please do subscribe to More Than a Game on Substack as well. There will be a link in the description of this video. Thanks very much.